All right, good evening, everybody. My name is Amalia Weber. I'm the program specialist here at Rochester Hills Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's Smart Towns program, What Social Movements Can and Cannot Do. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details. Firstly, tonight's program will be recorded and available to view about 1 week from tonight on our YouTube page and on the RHPL website shortly after. We ask the audience members please silence or turn off their cell phones before we begin in order to avoid any disturbances during the presentation. Our next program, Pearl Harbor and the American Response, another Smart Towns presentation, will be an in-person event on Tuesday, December 6th at 7 p.m. You can sign up for that at calendar.rhpl.org. Tonight's program is presented in partnership with Smart Towns, a lifelong learning program for everyone in the community, led by educational organizations in Rochester, Rochester Hills, and Oakland Township, Michigan. Smart Towns offers lectures, presentations, and courses that introduce the participants to all aspects of the topic and are presented by experts in their respective fields of study. And so, without further ado, please welcome our presenter, Dr. Joe Reger.
Thank you, and thank you to the library for letting me do this tonight. One of the things I love to talk about is social movements, and as it says here, I am actually a professor of sociology at Oakland University. I've been there for the last 20 or so years, and I've been involved in studying social movements. So I'm really excited to see people that I don't know. I know some of these people, they came as friends, but to see people I don't know who are interested also in social movements. So I just want to start and just talk a little bit about me, because what a great topic to begin with, right, myself. And part of the reason, these are all books that I've either edited or written, and I put it up here because I want you to understand that this is really kind of a lifelong commitment I made in terms of studying how the world changes and how it is that people come together and make change. Because this idea of the collective nature of social movements is something that's always really captured something in my heart and in my mind. So one of the reasons I have a picture up, it's a little old, but I'm standing here in Seneca Falls, where the first meeting of what we came to call the women's rights movement, right, for around issues of suffrage and property ownership and things like that. I'm standing behind what they think was the podium that Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony stood at. And so I love that picture because I like the idea that you can still reach out, even with social movements that are past, you can still reach out and be a part of that or sense that history. So I've done things on theories. So some of these books are theoretical books, you know, how do we understand things, big frameworks. And then some of them are questions that I tried to answer, one of them being everywhere and nowhere, contemporary feminism in the United States. People were always asking me, you know, what's going on? Is the women's movement dead? Do young people still identify as feminists? So that book was really my opportunity to try to answer some of those questions. So I just wanted to kind of share that so you know that I do have a little bit of my, know-how in what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. So why? Why social movements? And I have to tell you that when I started teaching social movements 25 years ago, I would often talk about them to my students, and they would look at me like they had no idea what I was talking about. And then finally, one of them would be like, "You mean stuff from the 60s?" You know, because when I was doing a lot of this in the mid-90s, late 90s, it didn't feel like there were a lot of social movements around us. It felt old. It felt like something from history. So I wanted to talk about it today because I think we're living in a time right now when social movements are all around us in a variety of different ways, right? And so I just went and grabbed the first couple of photos that I could find. This one, Iranian women who are taking off their veils and scarves, right? Big protests going on right now. Interesting that it's often when we see these types of movements and these types of environments under these types of state structures, it's the women who are able to begin the revolution. This is after a school shooting. So these are students, high school students who are protesting, asking for gun control. This one is from the coronavirus, when it was called the China virus, and we saw this rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. And so this is a response by the Asian American community to those hate crimes, to that kind of language being labeled as a problem. And then this one down here, it says housing is a human right. And I pulled this one because that's just a regional one. It's like Minnesota, somewhere in Minnesota. But we often think of social movements as happening on these big national levels, but sometimes they happen in our neighborhoods. And they happen around issues that we care about. So we either want affordable housing or we don't want that trash burning power plant. And so when we think about where we are today in our society, we're really actually surrounded by social movements. And I think maybe some of you came today because you're interested in how that works. So I think it's important to discuss what do we mean when we talk about social movements as an idea, and then what are they able to achieve in society? So I would argue, as a sociologist, not a historian, that the history of the United States is really a history of social movements and protests. That we can see this from the Tea Party, if you want to talk about that, as a social movement, right? Thinking about, pre-Revolutionary War. But we can think about throughout our history, many of the things that have shaped and changed our society have been social movements. They have been the beginning of a policy discussion or a series of laws or a culture change. So I grabbed a couple photos here. This is the Black Women's Club movement. Lifting as we climb is their slogan. And they partnered with white women around suffrage, but they also organized around to stop lynching. So there's a big anti-lynching campaign. And the Black Women's Club movement often gets ignored historically, but it was this really important piece, this thread of organizing that existed that the civil rights movement builds on later. This one, Chicano Power, here's another kind of organization or group of people that we don't often think about when we think about social movements in the United States, but people who identified as Chicano, we would say Latinx today, or Hispanic, began to organize in the 70s along with blacks, along with other movements, in order to have, to regain control of their culture and their communities, but the same sort of struggle going on. And then here at the end, some of you may know this, Vincent Chin. Does anybody know who Vincent Chin is? He was killed in 1982. He's a Chinese man. It was a time here in Detroit where auto workers were out of work, car industries weren't doing well, Japanese car makers were moving into the market, and he was spotted, identified as Japanese, and then murdered. Now, it's a very sad story, but one of the interesting things that comes out of the murder of Vincent Chin is we begin to see the Asian American community begin to organize in ways we've never seen before, because they've always been a community that often doesn't want to make waves, right? Often some of the newest immigrants to a community or have adopted ideas about how it is that you succeed. And so this idea of a protest happening in the 80s is pretty amazing, and it forms kind of, once again, these roots that carry through until today's time. So that's just 3 little snippets. But I would argue, as a social movement scholar, that a lot of the world we live in today, the history that we have, really is a history that's involved in a whole series of different social movements and protests. So that history is a conflicted history, because for every movement, there's usually a group of people or a movement that's opposing it. So I just pulled a couple of photos here. These are women arguing against segregation. So this is when we're talking about in the 60s, early 70s, when schools began to desegregate. And I think you've all probably seen those photos, right, of the black women, young black men walking into the schools and just surrounded by whites screaming. So what that tells us is that those movements don't come easy, and they're often conflictual, right? They're often moments of a lot of turmoil in society. This one came from like yesterday. This is a protest against drag queens. And it says, drag is not a value, drags need prayers, not public platforms. God created them male and female. And I'm sorry that it's a little blurry to see. And so, as you know, right now, we're in this moment in time where there's a lot of organization about what should our children see, what's appropriate for our children to see, how people understand what it means to not be heterosexual, right? These are all things that are up for debate, and people are actually organizing around it. This is an organized protest against this idea of drag queens, and I think a lot of it comes from drag queens coming to public libraries and reading books and things like that. This idea of drag queens being integrated into our society. The interesting thing is that drag queens have been around for a really long time. And they used to be controversial in the gay, lesbian, gay, LGBT movement because they were too flamboyant and they didn't want to be too flamboyant. And now they kind of disappeared. Now they're coming back again as a problem. So it's interesting, too, to think about what gets labeled an issue and then how that can show up later in society. So when we talk about social movements and social movement history, we're talking about turmoil, conflict. People are unhappy. People are striving. People feel like they're being oppressed, not heard, not listened to. So these are times in society where I think the more we understand about social movements, the easier it is to kind of live in a society with them, to understand why people are doing what they're doing. I love this. I love to show this to my students because one of the things that this tells us, and this is an anti-suffrage advertisement, and I don't know if you can read it. It says, the home and it looks like street corn, but it's really street corner. Okay, street corn makes it really funny. Street corner for women, vote no on women's suffrage. Now today, we would not find this controversial. Would we find this controversial? I don't know. There's been people lately saying maybe women shouldn't have the vote, right? We've had people in public office and people who are kind of public pundits saying those things. But women, large numbers of women, argued they should not have the right to vote. And today that just doesn't seem to fit, right? But part of that is, what did suffrage mean to a culture in which, and when we're talking about women, we're really talking about white women who could afford to be at home, that didn't have to go out and work. What did suffrage mean to them? It meant that they were going to lose some of that protected space where they were allowed to be kind of removed from public society and taken care of. And there was a huge concern that once women could vote, that they would be kind of pushed out into society along with the men. And that public sphere was seen as a place that wasn't fit for women, white middle-class women, right? Because there's some women who've always worked and never had that. So what it tells us, too, when we look at things like this and we think about social movements, it tells us that sometimes when people oppose things, they're opposing it because they're afraid of what it will do to the life that they're living. What will this take away from me? And I think that's an interesting thing to think about, right? So when things don't seem appealing to us, they seem wrong to us about what somebody's arguing for, sometimes it's about who we are and how we have positioned ourselves and are positioned in society. So what should we know? This is where I'm going to get real teacherly for a second. I always like this definition of social movements because I think it gives us a lot of ideas to work with. So social movements are loosely organized, relatively enduring forms of social organization that seek to change or reorganize society in some way. And if you were my students, I would be like, now I want you to underline loosely organized, relatively enduring. Those are important words, right? This idea that it's not chaos, right? That it's not just people show up one day and they figure out what they're going to do in a social movement. There's something there that has some form of organization to it. It could be an organization or a network or a community. But there's something there that gives it structure. It can't just be a bunch of people, because that's something else. That's a crowd or a mob or whatever. And I think the important elements for this is that it's sustained. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how a lot of movements have roots in the past. But movements often stick around for a while. They morph into other things. They disappear sometimes into public policies, or they get incorporated into bureaucracies, but they are sustained. They're oppositional to the status quo. And this is the one I want everybody to hang on to, because if everybody agrees with what a group of people want, it's not a social movement. Social movements are oppositional to the status quo. People, and large numbers of people in society, often find these things really problematic, right? There's something about them that pushes in a way that feels uncomfortable. So, there are moments in our society where everybody's kind of going with an idea. Does anybody remember Hands Across America? Kind of. Okay, there was this moment, and I think it was like in the 90s, where the idea was everybody would go outside on a certain day at a certain time and all hold hands with each other, and that, like, all these communities, you know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah, so it was this idea of, like, let's come together. That's not a social movement, because there's really nothing oppositional in that. Like, who would argue that connecting with your neighbor is a bad thing? So sometimes people come together in large groups, but they're not really social movements, right? They have common values, a common identity. So often people in social movements will identify themselves in a certain way. I'm an environmentalist. I'm a feminist. Right? So there's some sort of term that people can come to use. I'm a warrior for my organization. It has a purpose, of course, and has some sort of target. So there has to be something that is being focused on. If anybody's been listening to or watching, reading the news, China right now is having some really interesting stuff happen where young people are protesting in the streets, which is very, very dangerous in China. And they're using all sorts of, like, sneaky ways to argue they want freedom. So I think, where's my math friend here? But there's some equation that it's called, like, the freedom something equation that they're using, and maybe that's the Chinese for it. But they're using that as kind of a keyword or a sneaky way of saying what they're seeking. So when we think about that, the target there is then the Communist Party, right? This idea of what's keeping them from freedom, from the freedom that they're seeking. Okay, so now we've got a definition that's going to help us kind of know what we're talking about, right? That this is more than a crowd, and that there's something going on here, right? That there's a focus, there's a goal, there's a target. So then, what can social movements do and not do? That was kind of the whole kicky little title I came up with. What can they and can't they do? Well, one of the things we know is that they don't appear overnight. They have long roots in the past. They're not spontaneous. And we like to think about them as spontaneous. We love the spontaneous story, right? Rosa Parks was tired, so she sat down, right? And that was the beginning of the desegregation of the bus system. Rosa Parks was a trained activist who had been involved for a very long time in the NAACP. She wasn't tired. She wasn't old. And it didn't happen overnight, right? Multiple women did it. She was just the best person to do it in terms of who she was. She made a good candidate for it. So I had a couple pictures here. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? So back to Seneca Falls, talking about women's rights, not just suffrage, right? Not just the right to vote, but talking about the right to divorce, the right to own your property, the right to keep your children, all these things, right? Multiple levels they argued for. This is the women's strike in the 1970s. So this is when the movement kind of resurges in the 60s and 70s, still actually pulling on some of the threads and ideas here, right? The right to have your own credit card, the right not to have to apply to a job on either the male or female side of the help wanted sign. Then we move all the way up to 2016, the Me Too movement, which everybody was like, where did that come from? Well, it actually has its roots in part of radical feminism, which began to talk about sexual harassment and domestic violence and rape. And so without those conversations, you don't have the Me Too movement that seems like it just kind of bubbles up. But it actually had a foundation there. It had the language, it had the terminology, it had, and also we had the ability to be connected through the internet. And that's a whole nother layer to this. And then this is just from the women's movements, or the women's marches, 2017, 18, and 19. And so the first one, women are wearing the pussy hats, right? Kind of responding to President Trump's statements at the time. But these end up being global, and they weren't just about sexual harassment, rape, and domestic violence. If anybody paid attention to that, they were about everything, right? They were about immigration, they were about criminalization, they were about all sorts of stuff, right? They were about, reproductive rights and reproductive justice and all sorts of issues there. Pay equity. But the point being is that these things all are connected to each other in some way. And at no point did any of these completely die out and a new one emerge. They hang around. They hang around in language and in culture. They hang around in organizations and in policies. They hang around in the memories of the people, right, from the previous generations. And so when we think about social movements and someone says, oh, a movement just happened, it's not spontaneous, I promise you that. There are spontaneous things that crowds of people do, but they're usually not social movements. So the other thing, another important thing is that you need more than grievances. And when we say grievances, we mean experiences of inequality. If experiences of inequality were sufficient for a social movement to arise, we would have seen a civil rights movement among Black Americans arising in this country long before the 1960s, correct? So we know it's more than inequality. You have to have other things in place because people can be oppressed and discriminated against for a really long time in a movement or in a society before a movement emerges. And sometimes no movement ever emerges, right? There's groups that are so oppressed, so discriminated, so exploited, that they never have a chance to develop a movement. So what makes a movement happen? Well, we need things like resources, time, money, connections, organizational foundations. Those things have to be in place. And you have to be in a society that has a little bit of an opening for you to begin that conversation. So what's happening in China right now that the communist government can't control is that they can't control all the social media. It's really hard to stop these young people from finding a new way of communicating with each other, right? So as long as there's a way to keep communicating, there's that opening that allows them to begin to organize. And we saw the same thing in Hong Kong, right? Long student protests, right? Those have really disappeared. The picture I gave you is the Ebenezer Baptist Church. Whose church? Martin Luther King, right? And the reason I wanted to show you this is because one of the resources that was necessary for the civil rights movement to emerge was the fact that Black communities owned their own churches. They didn't own the stores, They didn't own the businesses. They may not have owned the schools, but they owned their own churches. They built them, they paid their ministers, they owned them. And when you have a place like a black church that you can bring people together, so if you think about all the pictures you've seen of the civil rights movement, they're always like singing in church. Part of the reason they're doing that is the church was a place the community owned. And so when you think about who emerges as the leaders, it's the ministers, right? Those are the people, but you have to have that resource in order for it to emerge. And so that's just one example, right? It's one example of how a movement needs something in order to emerge. And so, if you think about it, the community comes together and they have money, they use Sunday, that's time, right? You can think about how all of these things play out. And this is actually an argument made by Eldon Morris, who wrote a book called The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement. And he looks at the role churches play in a lot of these campaigns that we're familiar with and how they actually are, in many ways, the foundation. Okay. Social movements don't always maintain their accomplishments. And we're actually living in a time where we're watching that happen right now. With the Dobbs decision, Roe v. Wade from 1973, the Dobbs decision got rid of Roe v. Wade. Now we're watching all sorts of organizing happening, pro and con, right, in communities. And so when one side wins, the other side mobilizes to win it back, right? And so many movements have what we call counter movements, and they go back and forth. People who study pro-life, pro-choice often say it's hard to tell which one's the counter movement anymore because they've gone back and forth so many times, right? So Roe v. Wade comes along, then we have decisions that begin to take away rights to different forms of reproductive health and abortion, state by state, right? It goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. What did we just see in Michigan? Prop 3, based on, right, regional organizing, back and forth, back and forth. So just because you win something doesn't mean you get to keep it. And that's an important lesson too. Just because you get that law, just because you get that policy, just because you elect that politician, doesn't mean that it will stay that way. Because one of the things we know as members of the society, right, is that there is kind of a wind of change, right? That things, economically, politically, socially begin to change, switch up in ways that then empower another group. The other thing we know is that whoever gets elected president, whoever is so thinking about pro-life and pro-choice, when there's a pro-choice president, pro-life ramps up. When there's a pro-life president, pro-choice ramps up. But when your president's in office, you often feel really safe, so your side kind of begins to what we call lose mobilization, right? So we also know that things like who we elect, who our president is, who our governor is, right? All of these things have a lot to do with how energized and sometimes fearful people feel about the issues they're concerned with. So sometimes social movements do engage in actions and with activists not everyone agrees with. So this goes back to the idea that movements are oppositional. That often in society, people are like, I don't really get why they're doing that, or I don't agree with that, right? And that's just what it means to be in a social movement. So many people often dislike or disagree with their tactics. And history tends to erase this, so we always think like, if I was around in the 60s, I would have been marching. Well, you may have, but you may not have, right? And you may have had a good reason not to, or you may have had a whole different way of understanding the world than you do now. So we tend to kind of erase that. Rosa Parks was controversial. She's not controversial now. We love her, right? But she was controversial, what she was doing, right? This picture up here, this is Marsha P. Anderson and Sylvia Rivera. So if you know anything about LGBTQ history, they were, And the way they describe themselves is transvestites. We would say transgender today. And they organized, it was called the, I got to tell you the name of it. I got it written down. It was called STAR. I think it's Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, right? And they basically were booed out of every time they tried to speak at a gay liberation movement. They were booed. They were asked to leave. They were kept from the podium. They weren't given a voice. They were seen as too extreme. They were seen as wrong image, right? That they were not going to be useful to the movement, and that they in fact were going to people would look at them and mock them and mock the movement. The movement wouldn't be able to proceed without them. The interesting thing is today, if you think about the way we talk about the LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer plus movement, a lot of times people talk about the drag queens as Stonewall as like the heroes, right? They were the ones that fought back against the police when everybody else just got arrested or ran away. So here we are, just a few years later, we look back at them as heroes. But a few years before that, they were really seen as a problem for the movement. So one of the lessons we can take away from this is that sometimes we're going to see people doing things, even if we agree with the movement, that we don't agree with what they're doing. And that's just part of what happens. That's just part of how movements are, because they are made up of a large number of people who often believe in a central goal, but come to it in different ways. And that's where the dissension and the arguments and all of that happens. And if you've ever tried to do anything with a group of people and make something happen, you know that people have different opinions. Even though you all want to get to the same place, you begin to argue about different ways of getting there. Social movements also don't always accomplish their goals quickly. So one of the things that we're talking about right now is the canceling of student debt, right? Now it's held up in a court in Texas. But I don't know if you're on Twitter, but anybody that has a college loan out is really excited about this, right? This idea that we have an educational system that people can enter into and then just basically be drowning in debt, and people literally paying them off for the rest of their lives and never ever making a dent, right? I think we all know somebody who can tell that story, right? So where does this come from? Well, actually, the Occupy Wall Street movement around 2011, do you remember this, when they were taking over the streets and living in the parks? One of the things they argued for, part of We Are the 99%, all about income inequality, they talked about the student debt campaign. They wanted people to begin to think about how we can eradicate student debt. This becomes a part of a cultural conversation. Some of our politicians pick up some of these ideas. Bernie Sanders is one of them, and begins to talk about it, right? Not necessarily saying I'm a member of Occupy, but saying this is an interesting idea, and here we are. We trickle it down. Now, is it going to happen? I don't know. But it's interesting, right? It's kind of on the cusp of happening. So sometimes these ideas seem pretty outlandish, but they work their way into the culture and into what we call the discourse, right? The stories that we tell, the way we understand the world, and then it shows up and it doesn't seem so crazy anymore. It doesn't seem like such a crazy idea. You know what this is? Right? This is Monet. This is a Monet with mashed potatoes on it. Except those are the runniest mashed potatoes. After having come from Thanksgiving, those are not my mashed potatoes, but you know what they're trying to do here. So sometimes social movements tell us stories we don't want to hear. And so the whole point of throwing, have you seen all the artwork, the tomato soup? There's several other ones. They're usually on pieces of artwork that have some sort of covering, so the artwork actually isn't damaged, but they have gotten some frames that have had to be cleaned or replaced. So part of what social movements do is they try to get our attention. So there's always going to be a part of a movement that's what we call the radical flank, that's going to be a little more outrageous. They're the ones that are going to chain themselves to the building. They're going to go live, remember, what was her name, Butterfly Hill? Was it Butterfly Hill? Something, Butterfly something. I can't remember what her, but she lived in that sequoia tree until she managed to stop them from logging the forest. Right, and that's pretty radical, go live in a tree for a long time. So part of it is, it's to get our attention, it's to get us to know, to pay attention to what it is they're arguing. And even if we don't like it, they still got our attention. So why did they throw mashed potatoes on a Monet? Yes. The world is dying, and all you care about is your art. Did you all know that? Yeah, that's why they're doing it. That's why, and it's always like pretty much young people, and a lot of them are happening in Europe, right, where there's huge concern over what's going on in terms of the environment. So the radical flank often is the one that people make fun of. That's the transvestites, right, the Star, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. They're the radical ones, but the interesting thing is that they often open the conversation for the more moderate part of the social movement to come through and to make an argument about why something is necessary. Okay, so I just talked a whole bunch. So what are my takeaways? So I would say the do's and don'ts, but I would say social movements do much, right? Much of the world that we live in is the result of social movements, politically, culturally, socially. So sometimes it's not the law or the policy that matters, it's the way in which we now think about a group of people, the way we use language, the way we understand them in terms of culture. So some of the most important ways that social movements make change is they help change the culture we're in. So the idea of women voting, like I voted, are you shocked? No, you're not, right? Because culturally we've moved way past that. We're more surprised when people don't vote than we are when people do vote. For many groups in society, social movements have improved lives and opportunities. And so there's a whole myriad of groups in society who have fought for rights and fought to be heard and live better lives because of that. Right? So we can think about things like the Americans with Disabilities Act and how disability right movement made it so like you could get into the library. The library had to find a way to get you in. You can't just build buildings anymore that people can't access. We have to make workplaces that accommodate people with disabilities, right? So this idea of living better lives. Some of the things that social movements don't do, they don't make us comfortable. I don't really like the idea they're throwing mashed potatoes on a Monet. I think Monets are beautiful, but okay, I get why you're doing it. So I'm going to allow myself to get why you're doing it, but still not like that you do it, right? Social change does not come quickly. That's the one thing we know. The world does not change quickly. It changes all the time, but not necessarily the way we want it to change, and in ways that we need it to be at a certain time. So often a push in one direction then leads to a push in another direction. And so we live in a society that's always going to be in flux. And I think, I would say as a social movement scholar, that's to be expected, right? And so the things we can do is we can try to understand why this side and why that side, right? Why is this an issue? And that helps us have a better grasp on the world that we live in. Okay, so I've talked enough. So thank you. Do people have any comments or questions? Sure.
How does social media play into these social movements? Because lately you see a lot of these social movements, and then you think they're being caused by bots, like from a different country.
Yeah.
You don't even know if there's another person on the other side.
Yeah.
Or if it's a country or a political movement. So do you think it's getting worse?
I think it's more problematic now than ever. I think when we first started having things like Facebook and, I don't know, Instagram, not so much, but when we first, or even email, when we first started having things like websites, social movements really took advantage of that. And there's a whole bunch of research on kind of online movements and like how they connect to in-person movements and how people are able to organize so quickly. So you want to have a protest the next Saturday, you can reach out to a bunch of people through email almost immediately. So social media has been very helpful, but we now live in a time of a lot of fake social media. So you're talking about bots, you're talking about purposely planting ideas, planting things on Twitter that aren't true, and they've showed a lot this happened with elections. So it's more problematic in kind of sorting out what's accurate information, right? So somebody can take over your website and start saying that you're endorsing all sorts of terrible things. That's not even a member of your group. So I think it is getting worse. I think I'm not a social media or computer science type person, but I do think that we're going to have to figure this out, because I don't know if we can tell reality from fake created reality anymore if we're only looking on social media. How do you tell real information from fake information? And there's a tremendous amount of incorrect information out there that's purposely meant to make you think a certain way. But propaganda is not new. Some of these things are not new. We've found ways to deal with them in the past, but I think it is a challenge right now, particularly thinking about how many movements do so much online. So much of the organizing, so much of all of this is online.
Because sometimes I see problems that are brought up that aren't really a problem, but they're making it a problem, like this book burning and stuff like that. I mean, these books have been in the library for years.
Yeah.
Someone's bringing it up and making a social movement out of it.
Yeah.
Half the people think it's ridiculous.
Yeah, and the thing is the beauty of social media is you can find people who think the same way you do. So if you don't like those books, or part of it is, are they truly telling you what the books are about, or are they telling you what they think the books are about, right? And so that's where it gets complicated. Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting, a lot of the examples I gave you were in person, on the ground, face-to-face organizing, and a lot of organizing today doesn't happen that way. It really happens through social media, through ways that we connect online. Yeah, good question. Questions or comments?
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
I don't know exactly where this is going, but some would call the MAGA movement a legitimate protest movement. And it kind of fits a lot of your definitions, but certainly isn't in the takeaway that you talked about. They usually seek to improve the lives of people. So is this an oppositional movement, or is this a legitimate regressive social movement?
I think,
MAGA just to,
yeah.
Anti-immigration, taking us backwards.
I think a lot of times we see counter movements organize over stopping change. So there's something some direction that society's going that people find frightening. Well, let's take suffrage again, right? And I think those dynamics always exist because, often people live in societies where they think it's kind of a zero-sum game. And if someone gets something, that means they've lost something, right? And it could be a belief in idea, it could be economic success, it could be opportunities, it could be something you feel someone's taking away from you. And so I look at, I think that to look at something like MAGA or anti-immigration or whatever, and to look at not whether or not you agree, but to look at what is the core belief here? What's the core fear here? It gives you a sense of like what's going on. And as somebody who just like looks at social movements a lot, I think a lot of what's happening right now is that the world has changed really, really quickly in a lot of ways. We're talking about things that we never talked about before. You know, when I first started teaching, and I would teach about the LGBTQ movement, I would have like gay people come in and talk to my class, right? Because the assumption was none of them were gay, right? This is a new identity. And a lot of my students were like, oh my God, I've never seen a gay person before, right? Now to do that now would be so ridiculous. My students would be like, oh my God, you're ancient, you old lady, stop. Where are you from? I used to, years ago, have a transgender person come in and talk about what it meant to be transgender. I wouldn't do that anymore in a college classroom because I probably have students who align themselves on that. So my point being is that we're living in a world where all of a sudden we're talking about new identities and new ways of people understanding their gender and sex identities. And I think, you know, I think that frightens people, whether they recognize it as fear or not. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but I do think there's something there. And I think that's, I mean, what is it to you that this young Black woman go to your high school, right? Why would you go stand outside and scream and spit on her? Well, obviously, I mean, we're like, you're a racist, but you're a racist because why? What do you believe is being taken away from you, or is being taken away from your children, or the way you want to live? And I think that's why people often respond the way they do to moments of a lot of change. We've just had a Black president. People are talking about transgender bathrooms. There's drag queens reading books to elementary students. You know, like they're like, oh my God, look at all this world is just wacky. So what happens is people begin to form ways to kind of protect. And if you look at a lot of organizations that are white supremacists or white nationalists or Christian nationalists, a lot of times they're really centered in an idea of what the world should be. And if you listen to some of their leaders, it's like, this is what the world should be. This is how people should be within the world. And so anything that begins to challenge that becomes a part of kind of what you could talk about like a counter movement.
It's more of a comment than a question.
Sure.
To love what she was saying. The kind of change that has happened in, you know, I would say my lifetime, or I don't know what unit measurement. It seems like it's accelerating at such a phenomenally fast pace, and you know, I don't think society can absorb it. I know I can't. But I don't know if there's other periods in history, and whenever that would be, that there was so much social change within, you know, like, let's say 30 years. That's probably 30 or 40 years. It just seems like it's going on really, really, like, almost like dangerously fast, and I don't think people can absorb it.
And I think that's true. I think we are living in an exceptional time for that. I think there's always periods of time, and there's something like economically or socially or politically that comes along and kind of boom, things, you know, we think about the 1920s being a period of time before the Depression of free love, and people were exploring their sexuality and marriage and open, you know, like all of these things, and right, and then, you know, we have this economic and political period that shuts it down to the point where we don't even really remember that existed, right? But I do think, you know, I think about in my own lifetime, and I always tell my students, I'm not 100 years old, so it's not like a century, but I did cross a century. I think about in my own lifetime what I've seen change. I remember when gay people used to be like on Phil Donahue, and everybody who was gay would go home and watch it because you never saw gay people, right? Now you can watch entire shows made up of gay people, and it's not really a big deal. Gay marriage. My daughter's 21. The idea that gay people wouldn't be allowed to get married, she's like, I don't understand that. Why would that be, right? But she grew up watching Ellen marry Portia on national television. So there is a ton of change. And I think when it really becomes an issue is when it begins to shake some of the things that we find to be the core of our society. So if we believe that marriage is a man and a woman, And that's where the family comes from, and that's who goes to work, and that's who does what job, and that's who takes care of. When that begins to be shaken up, then you see people begin to organize to stop that, right? So yeah, I think you're right. We live in a kind of a crazy time. It's not the first crazy time, but it is a crazy time. Yes?
How much would be considered too much or too radical movement? Like you were talking about, you don't really like the throwing of the food on the paintings, right? Some people would view that as too much. Is there something that like the majority of people would be like, hey, you're devaluing your movement by doing this?
I think that's a hard question to answer, because for every person that would say that's too much, there's probably someone saying, hit another one with more mashed potatoes. You know, I think that's the issue is where are you kind of on this continuum of beliefs, right? Are you really freaked out about climate change, or are you kind of freaked out, or you're not really paying attention? If you're not paying attention, mashed potatoes on a Monet don't make sense. If you are paying attention, you're like, oh, I hope they don't hurt the Monet, but go ahead, get more attention, right? Do something radical. So I think it depends on where people are. Is there something that a social movement can do that an entire society would be against? That's a good question. People have blown up buildings and killed people for social movements, and there's still people in the social movement who said that it was justified, right? So even taking life isn't seen as too much. A guy set himself on fire to protest climate change. Got more attention got less attention than the mashed potatoes did. Nobody said, oh, okay, that's it, we gotta pay attention now, that's too much. So yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. Historically, I can't think of examples that we now look back on, but I'm sure to people during it. I mean, a bus boycott in Montgomery, that's too much, right? And we know that's one of the reasons why we have a desegregated society. Yes?
I was just going to say, just as an example, that like the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot on the right were really critiquing that movement for burning down, one's own neighborhoods, et cetera, as kind of an example of going to.
Yeah, yeah, right, yeah. Defunding the police became kind of, for some people, that was like, that's too much, right? But other people, I mean, there are cities that started to look at how to like change police budgets, So that's I guess my point about it being oppositional is that it's always going to make somebody mad. Because if it doesn't make somebody mad or uncomfortable, it's not a social movement, right? And even people within the movement can be like, oh, I'm not sure we should be doing that. But it still happens. Yeah.
Many of the social movements are underpinning the political. I'm just wondering if all of you go to each other's lectures, political science department, read each other's books, or you stay in your own silos?
I do. I actually do read a lot of political science, and the idea about Occupy and that comes from David Meyer, who's a political scientist. I'm like, oh, that's such a great insight. So I do pay attention to that. We tend to look at things sometimes a little differently, which makes us kind of a little more of a silo, because communication also does a lot with social movements. I'm trying to think of there's lots of different disciplines that look at aspects of it. I mostly look at like why people do what they do. As a sociologist, I'm always interested in like why people do what they do. So I look at it that way. But your question about social media, communication scholars look a lot at how we talk and how we communicate, and look at all these, so they have a whole bank of research on that. And I try, in the time that I have, I try to like keep looking. I've read some cool stuff from anthropologists, and so we do try to talk to each other.
By the way, I went to university in Utah, Salt Lake City, and then went to San Francisco. So things are very regional.
They are very regional. They are very, and you'll go some places and you'll be like, there's no problems here. And then you go someplace else and it's like, they're not doing anything like I thought, right? Yeah. My sister just started working for Yellow Springs, which is in Ohio. It's where Antioch College used to be. And she's working with the city government, and she's like, I have to take my own can of pop in because they don't allow any pop dispensing machines because they don't like the amount of sugar and how it just encourages people to like engage. And she's like, there's no paper napkins, so I have to bring a towel so after I wash my hands, I can wipe my hands on some, so she's cracking me up, but she's kind of in this environment that's so environmentally conscious that it's like reminding her everywhere she goes, like, this is where I work, but where I live is a little different, right? The other places that I've worked, so yeah. It's very regional. And sometimes those regions, if you think about, part of the reason why San Francisco and New York City became such gay hotspots, that's where they dropped off all of the soldiers after World War II. So all the men who had found other men or women who had found other women, they ended in these urban environments and they stayed there. They didn't go back to Nebraska or North Dakota. They stayed. And that's where we see really the beginning of the modern gay liberation movement. Has a lot to do with what happened after the war was over. So it's all regional.
So, in one of your terms, you said that social movements have to be resourced and organized and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of them that don't succeed, so like Tiananmen Square and Arab Spring and like these ladies in Iran right now are probably going to fail. Is that because they're not resourced? I mean, I can't imagine they have money. I think they're just fighting against depression from the government.
Yeah, and so sometimes, like with Tiananmen Square was an interesting situation because it looked like the beginning, and this is in China, right, the Chinese Student Revolution, and Tiananmen Square became the space, right? And so everybody went to the space. So it's kind of like the Black church. And they were supported to a certain degree by the people around them. So they had some resources. The problem with Tiananmen Square, and I suspect what's happening now in Iran, because I hear that they're going to start assassinating, or they're going to start killing the protesters, is that if it's not the right political moment, and this is what I get from my political science friends. They call it political opportunity structures. But if it's not the right moment, like what happened with Tiananmen Square is that the Communist Party kind of backed off it for a while, and then they were like, okay, this is too much, and then they squashed it, right? Because there was no other place for that movement to go. Once the Communist Party brought the tanks in, it was over. Hong Kong, same thing. They backed off, and then they came in and they squashed it. Now, Hong Kong is in a terrible place right now, right? I suspect the same thing, Arab Spring. Sometimes the political resource, right, that openness, that opportunity to get into the government, that opportunity to get a new leader, or whatever that is that makes that change, if that's not there, and it's, a dictatorship or a regime, it's very easy to, making hand motions. It's very easy to squash it, right, to get rid of it. So an open environment helps. Like the fact that we have rape crisis centers now is because radical feminists found a way to get into the bureaucracy of hospitals, right? Hospitals have a lot of rape crisis centers, but they also got, city governments to help fund them. So there was these foundations, like the Ford Foundation, which would give you money to run your, so, this idea that there was a place for this radical argument to work its way into continuous resources and survive. So, you can, well, unless you can overthrow the government and get somebody in there that's going to, but the problem is, and we've seen this happen, like they overthrow the government and they get somebody in there that's even worse, right? So, it's interesting to keep an eye on these things. Yeah, what's going on in Iran? I think, is it Brazil that just elected the progressive president and they're still trying to get him in office? So these things, they don't change quickly. Other comments? Sure.
I don't know how to frame it. I see there's been a lot of social movements, and I don't know if this is a question for just our country alone or it's a global thing, but my feeling this last at least 5 years, maybe 10 years, that everybody's angry.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody's angry about everything. You got the road rage. You get people, just what was it? Somebody didn't get a tip or something last week, and they got into a fight on the news, or there was a shooting because they didn't give the proper tip or something. It just seems like there's just an insurmountable amount of anger in society right now, and it's really kind of scary that I don't know why people are not like trying to suppress their anger. They just say whatever they feel, and it's just. I'm really worried about the anger and the rage that is just has an undercurrent to everything.
Yeah. Well, I think you're not alone. I think a lot of us feel that way. I'm not sure social movements are responsible for that, but I think societal turmoil is responsible. I think people feel afraid. I think the pandemic made people, it really brought up a lot of dividing lines between people. People felt comfortable kind of telling each other what they thought in ways that maybe in the past we wouldn't have. I was just having a conversation with my spouse about we never, don't cut people off. Don't get mad if they cut you off. You don't know who has a gun in their car. That's the world we live in now, and that's not just being paranoid. So I think you're not alone. Yeah, it's interesting to think like how we're going to come out of this, and if there's some sort of social movement behind it. Who knows? If there could be something.
People are always, their go-to position is to think the worst about people instead of thinking the best of them.
Yeah.
Have an opportunity to explain or whatever. Like, why get mad at the waitress because she's, didn't cap her coffee off right away? Just the anger is just really scary.
Yeah. Oh, I agree with you. And I think sometimes that anger comes from fear, right? People are afraid of something. Yeah. Okay. Are we done? Okay, well, great. Well, thank you all.